Hello everyone, I just want to welcome you back. Today I want to talk about urban operations. So I don't want this to be considered necessarily a review, but I want to talk about different aspects of the game that I like why do I like this game. And I had to admit I wasn't quite sure what I thought of it at first. So I'll point out some things that maybe could be better. So first of all, the rule book. That's what we have right here. Here's the rules of play. Now, it's not a huge book. Let's see here, how many pages? 20. It says 31 pages of rules. There's some advanced rules, some design notes. So really, you're looking at around 29 pages of rules, and they're not very dense. They have a lot of pictures. Just kind of show you around. Have a lot of pictures, lots of examples, so you're not getting something really dense. Plus, some of the rules repeat, which isn't bad either, because they'll mention certain terminology in one section of the book, and then as you read through, it'll come back and mention some things again. But I think what makes it difficult is that some of the concepts of the game are kind of new. Maybe not new to me, maybe not new to gaming. But there's just some things that until you actually play, when you read about it, it just kind of seems, huh? But that's what I want to talk about then is how does this game kind of run? Alright, so let me just set the rules aside for a second. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at some of the player aid cards and then some of the different cards that they have. So speaking of cards, here are some of the cards that come with the game. Now, the ones that I have here specifically are for the Mogadishu campaign and specifically Scenario 1. Now, on these cards, you're going to have an event. Red text means when you draw the card, you would play it immediately. Then there's some black text, which means you can kind of hold on to it and use it when you want. Down here in the corner, it's going to show you what scenario you use it with. So you could use this card with Scenario 1, Scenario 3, 5, or 6. So you're going to have, let's find them here. There's a couple cards. But essentially you're going to grab together all of your cards that are labeled like, Mogadishu in this example for Mogadishu. And then you're going to have actually down here color-coded. It's going to let you know if that's for the red team or are they going to be for the green team. Okay, so you're going to end up with a set of cards for each player. And then as you play the game, the rules will tell you when you would pull those cards. The scenario says, we'll draw a card at the start of each play, or it's in the play sequence when you would check for events, cards, and things like that. So you're going to have two sets of, I say two sets, so this is the first set of cards. These are basically the event cards that you'll have. Now the other set of cards that you have are these informational cards. So looking at the, say, Mogadishu example, you have this card which represents the militia. So it's going to say, it says here SNA, so like a Somali National Army. It'll say, infantry, the AK-47, that's their weapon. Little circular symbol tells you what this weapon is effective against. So when we look at the blocks, you'll see that the different block types will have a symbol. So circle is pretty much like for infantry. This triangle for the RPG represents most targets. And then the platoon leader up here has an AK. Now the numbers down here, this represents basically the combat stats. Each block is a set of range. So the first block is basically out to range 1, like 1 hex away. Then the second block is out to 5 hexes away. And that third block, so you just keep adding 5. So this is essentially 10 hexes of range that you could shoot. Then beyond that, that is something else we'll talk about, weapon effect. So this has a really nice way of showing things like the blast from a tank, the blast explosion from like an RPG round when it hits, and then this weapon effect where it's that square and arrow that continues on. that indicates like a firing lane. And we'll kind of cover some of those topics there here in a second, which I think some people, what I've read on forums, like it doesn't quite click, like why do we have this, how does the weapon effects work? But hopefully we can discuss what that means and why I think that's a pretty cool tool. But that's something you're going to have then for each participant. So with the Mogadishu, they also have Rangers and Delta Force. So you'll have 2 sets of that. And then I thought I had them here. Let me just take a quick peek for those scenarios where you have it. You might have what they call 3D. I think that's something that kind of is weird because the game really does cover huge expanses of time. Like I got Mogadishu here, which is 93. Folded Gap, which is 85 here. If we look at the cover, Folded Gap, 85. I think what they try to do, I mean it works once you kind of get used to it, is use some terminology that transcends time, force. So instead of saying, you know, air assets, we just say 3D elements, essentially. All right, so sometimes the wording is a little weird, but I think they kind of came up with a universal wording style that would apply across all the campaigns, nationalities, and conflicts. So those are the cards that you'll be dealt with when you start a scenario. And each booklet, so for example the Mogadishu booklet, not only, I'll show you the player card here in a second, but sometimes it will have here inside the player booklet a little bit of history, but it's going to give you some victory conditions. Sometimes might give you some additional rules that are going to be used for the game. But most everything you need as far as setting it up, the cards that you need, we're going to take a look at on the player card. So let's take a look at the player cards. So each scenario you're going to get a card for each side. So for example, this is from the Mogadishu campaign, and this would be for the, I guess you want to say the Allied forces. This would be the green team, so this would have your Rangers, your Delta Force. And these are called impulse forces. So what you have here, as far as letting you know what troops you have, these are your impulse forces. Then it's going to have, for example, here's my 3D support, like my air support. That would be down here, so each card will designate what you have available. In the chart, not to go too in depth, but essentially the chart will let you know how many times you can use this when it arrives. And but we'll look at the specific chart information here in a little bit. Then it's going to show you your map, where you can set up initially. There's the crash site, second platoons coming in through here, first platoon, and then here on the side specifically some setup rules. So here's where I would set the Super X1 Rec, which is right over here on the map, and then this tells you where you'd place the other troops as they initially come on. Now this is the big thing here. You're going to have your blocks, and you could just, like what I do when I'm setting up for a scenario is I've got all my blocks here in a baggie for this scenario. I'm learning the rules still myself. I'm not an expert yet, but for this first scenario I just put everything I need here in a bag with my dice. So what I do is I've got this guy here, so I know he's going to be down here as part of Impulse Force 3. So I just, you know, stick him there. Line up everything I need. Now again, this is another one of those things like, what is an impulse force? Well, essentially, think of that as like a platoon. This is first platoon, second platoon. And the reason why you call that an impulse force, again, is trying to find some of that universal wording that applies across all the maps, all the you know, generations of play, all nationalities. Now here it does say platoon, but that's just kind of what I think of here. Plus, when you're playing in the turn and your impulses go back and forth between you and your opponent, you activate basically one impulse force at a time, one platoon. All right, so that's sometimes where some of the confusion comes in, is they use terms that aren't quite what I normally use when I think of a war game. But that's what an impulse force is. So you would just line up your blocks according to your impulse force and then lay them out according to your setup. And then each player has one of these cards. So like I said, here's the American one, and then you would have one of these for the Somali player as well. Kind of says where you're set up, where your reinforcements come in, a little bit of history, and then you can lay your troops out according to your platoon layout. And then when you place them in there, it talks about your event cards, how you interact with the environment. On the back, because some people like to see the back, it's just another scenario. So Alone in the Moog. Alright, so you're just going to use the one side corresponding to your mission, set up your troops, and then you're going to start playing. So that's the player aid card. So when you play the game, you're going to have your map. Each player will have their player aid chart here, or player aid card. You're going to have all of your troops lined up on here. Then you're going to have maybe an additional counter. So for like here, this has got like, the medics with them. So you might get some of these. And then that's about it. You got your cards, blocks, sheets, map. Then you just start setting up according to the scenario rules. So then how would you play the game? Alright, so we'll take a look at that next. So let's say it's time to start shooting at each other, move troops. How does the game work? Well, in your scenario cards, use the player aid cards, or in the campaign book, it'll have rules on how to determine initiative. Such as for the first scenario here in the Mogadishu campaign, it says that the American troops have initiative first. And then you have to roll a die later to see if they retain initiative. Now, when you want to go do something, it's actually not much different than any other war game. See, like when you play a war game, some of the things you might want to think about is what I call the move, shoot, and communicate. How do you move, how do you shoot, and how do you communicate that information to your soldiers? Well, just like most games, you have movement points for your soldiers. And the way the game does it, in the book it says there's some modifiers to that, but essentially if you say are in line of sight of somebody, then you get 6 hexes that you can move, and then those modifiers would be for like terrain and things like that. Now if you are going to move and have it be completely out of line of sight of your opponent, so let's say I've got somebody up here and he was going to move maybe along this street out of line of sight because you got all these buildings in the way, then you can move up to 9 hexes. So easy. Basically that's just saying that you feel safe, you're not engaged, so you're moving. As you get closer to enemy contact, then you're more cautious, you don't move as much. That to me is kind of what that represents. So there you go, that's movement. Then there's rules you have for entering buildings. So you enter a building, then there's walls, you can't go through the walls, so you would movement point, you're stuck. Some of the larger buildings have 2 spaces, it's like you would move in, that's a movement point, that may be a movement point. There's a little divider there, but you just go through it. So it's nothing super complicated. There might be a few spots that are a little bit bigger, but then they have this white line is the same thing. Like if I was here, movement point to go in, a movement point to cross the threshold there. So again, nothing totally different than what you would expect from a war game. One thing though, as far as stacking goes, you cannot stop in the same hex. So if these were 2 friendly forces, you can move through, but you can't end up on. And then of course if they're opposing, they're not going to be able to move through each other. So not to dwell too much on movement, that's essentially what you've got. It's just like most games. Combat, that's the part that starts to look a little weird. I say weird because a lot of games, your information is printed on your blocks. What you have here on these blocks, they're very generic because they're going to be used among all these different scenarios that cover different conflicts, nationalities. So it'll tell you infantry, you have your triangles which represent their operational strength level. So 2, and then eventually a 1, and then they're eliminated. Now the combat I think is pretty good. I don't see this in a whole lot of games. But when one person decides to shoot at another person, you're going to count your difference or distance. But when you roll the dice, for example, you're not looking at combat stats printed on the block. Like, you know, this person, like, here, let's show you here. I'll put the card away, but I need to pull the card back out. The information you need is not on the block, right? That's what these cards are for. So, for example, if I'm using my infantry, let's say this block here belonged to Delta Force, I'd use my information on the M16 line. So if I was 1 hex away, I would be assaulting, and I would have this 9 value. That's basically the attack strength. Then as I count my distance out, that second block goes out to 5, that goes out to 10, and then this is 5 hexes beyond for your fire lane. So let's say, for example, here, then I would count 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that would put me within the second block. I have a firepower of 8. So what do I do with that? Well, my opponent has some decisions to make. When I'm shooting, my opponent can either decide to withdraw, which means they kind of, you know, pull away from combat. Maybe it's a tank shooting at them and they don't have adequate firepower to shoot back at a tank, for example, or they just don't want to engage in combat. They can do a withdrawal, which means they don't take damage necessarily from this guy, but when they retreat, there's a little chart they roll on to see if something happens when they do a withdrawal. Let's see if I got the withdrawal chart here. Nope. Anyway, we'll find that chart later. We got lots of charts to look at. But you would roll on a chart and it would say, okay, you either took damage or no damage for doing your withdrawal. Alright. Oh, here it is. It's on the bottom of the combat chart. So if you want to withdraw, let's see, until... Oh, okay, you can move 2 movement points with a foot unit or up to 4 with a vehicle block, but here's the rule. So there's a chance that you would still take some damage for doing withdrawal, but there's a chance that you can get away without being shot by a far superior enemy. Or let's say you want to shoot. Maybe you want to go ahead and have them fire. So that's one thing I like about this game. It's not the traditional, I'm going to take a moment and my guy shoots at your guy. When they engage, it's actually a gun battle. So the fighting is simultaneous. There's a chance that the person engaging the combat might not be the one who scores damage. Things might go to where the person being shot at is the one who actually inflicts damage because they have a much better gunplay. So how does that work out? Well, when you look at your combat cards here, you would calculate for the gun battle the same way that you do for the Americans. So you're going to count your distance of 4 hexes. What do we say? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I've moved them, but let's say 5. Well, for an AK-47, out to that 5 range, that second block, they have a gun value of 7. Whereas the M16, they had a gun value of 8. Now you might say, well, you know, the AK-47 is better than an M16. But this is also representative of the force type. That's why it's on a specific card. So Delta Force is maybe trained a little bit better, so they have a better gun value. Now the way that the combat works, and they have this worked out on a chart. It's actually a pretty big combat chart. But it's easy. It just kind of works in a flow. So you can read the rules, which, you know, is recommended because you get your play examples, but how to work a combat is done really well on this combat chart. So you declare who is shooting who, or an assault, and if you withdraw, then you follow the withdrawal rules, and then kind of follow your arrows. So let's say we're just doing a gun battle where nobody is withdrawing. You have your 2 dice that you roll. So the red player, green player. You roll. Then you're going to want to roll to where, well, if you have a tie, it says what you do for a tie. But essentially, you do a die roll and you look at these modifiers. So it says if somebody rolled a 7 to 9, there's a chance that there was a critical hit, which might add another plus to the person who rolled a 7 or 8. Or if you roll a 9, the block wins the fight, plus it does an additional operational step loss for the person who loses. And then, see here it says also versus the symbol. That's a pretty cool thing too. So every block type then is given a symbol, and you can see here in the background. So that's like your infantry symbol, the circle. So when you're versus infantry blocks, this would be the results of a critical hit. If against a square block, here's the results. And then that corresponds with your weapon types, because they have symbols that say it's this type of weapon. And that type of weapon is effective against, you know, infantry or light vehicles. And then if you have something like a triangle, against heavy weapons. So that's how they determine what you can shoot against. It's just use symbology. You know, so if I had an AK-47, I'm not going to shoot at tanks, but if I was shooting at a tank, I'd use the RPG because that's your tank symbol. And they've actually got a handy dandy, let's see if it's on one of these, just to help you determine what can shoot at what. Right there. So circle can shoot at foot units, square can shoot at foot units and armored vehicles, the triangle can shoot at any target, and then you got a breed symbol, and then the little house with an X means you can't shoot from in a building, so like the RPG. So we already know we've rolled a die, since we're following combat. Nobody rolled a critical hit. There was a tie, so there was no, you know, nobody got like the upper hand on that. Let me just check real quick. I forgot on ties. Hold on. Alright, yeah, I just had to double check. So yeah, if in case of a tie, which we rolled here was a 4, there's no bonus. So if you had each rolled, say, 9s, those would cancel each other out. So, you know, ties aren't terrible, but here then you have your modifiers. So for example, if your block is within 6 EPs of your platoon leader, you get +1. What's an EP? Well, this is what is another thing that's kind of interesting to the game. Not only do you have movement points, and a lot of people are familiar with the concept of movement points, but EPs are similar, except those are effect points. So things like weapon ranges, it's kind of like a separate movement point system for effects. Which we'll talk about in a moment, but I think that's another concept. People are like, well, why do we have MPs and EPs? But essentially, if you have, let's say, let me give you just a quick example of like an EP. If I have, let's say this is my platoon commander, and this is a unit. I have 6 EPs to yell at folks. Well, beyond a wall, you can only go 2 EPs, like a distance of 2. So if I had a unit that was, say, in this building, and my platoon commander out here, the guy in the building, because his EPs are blocked by the walls, he couldn't hear him yell orders to get the +1 bonus to combat. See, a lot of games, you just simply say, oh, am I in the radius of my commander? I am. Here, it says you have a radius, but that radius is modified by the terrain as well. Oh, okay, that's pretty neat. So even though it says if you're within 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 puts you way up here in a whole other building, he would not benefit. This guy up here gets no bonuses because these walls and whatnot block the effective range of those bonuses, the EP effects. Same thing with like if you shoot through a wall, the weapon effect. If I shoot a RPG and it hits the wall, I can only go like 2 spaces beyond the wall, and then the EP stops because the wall, you know, effectively prevents the round going the rest of the way. But it allows you to have like shrapnel, shock, you know, sound waves, blast, affect units that are beyond the wall. So it's a little bit different than the full-on hit of a grenade. Okay, so I'm just kind of rambling there a bit, but we'll talk about that in a second. But just like any other game, right, you roll die, the person with the higher result gets a +1 to their firepower, and if it's a 9 or a 7, 8, or 9, there's a potential of a critical hit, but if it's a tie, all that's negated. So then, after you add in things like terrain and different benefits that you have, whoever has the higher firepower wins, which is down here, combat results. So if you're fire, if it's a tie, if your final modified firepower, so like if I took that 7 that he had for the AK and his 8 that he's got for the M16, and all the modifiers, dice rolls, everything turns out that they both say had a 9. they would each take 1 point loss. So they would each have to flip to an operational strength. If the American player, say, had the higher final score, then just the one guy would flip to have 1 operational loss. And then if it's an assault is basically you're just within 1 hex and you do your combat, then the chart result would be same thing. Smaller total takes 2 losses. So if I was at a 3, I'd flip, have 1 arrow left, and would treat 2 hexes. If it's a tie, they don't go anywhere, but they each take a loss. I mean, it's that easy. So you just compare your number, roll a die, determine if it's a tie or if somebody gets a critical hit, or apply regular modifiers. Whoever has the highest firepower at the end wins, or a tie. Now, the only other thing, though, to combat is if it's an elite unit or a veteran unit or a recruit. And on your card, it's going to tell you what's the, what's their rating. So, for example, these guys here in Impulse Force 2, they're all veterans. Well, all elite. They have 3 stars. Okay, so what does that do for us in combat? Well, you get to roll. Recruits don't absorb combat as well as, say, an elite unit. A veteran unit, which is just regularly trained troops, they just take the combat result. But in the case of Somalia, your Somali troops are recruits, and your Delta Force Rangers are elite. So if I was going to take a step loss, I just roll here as an elite unit. Roll. I roll a 7, and it says 0 to 5. You apply the loss. If you roll a 6 to 9, you lower the losses by 1 operational strength. So if I was going to take 2 points of damage, I would only take 1. Or if they said I was supposed to take 1 point of damage, I would take none. So your elite troops are able to take advantage of the terrain, the cover, they flop down, they hide, whatever the case may be, they absorb combat better. Now, if I was a Somali national player and I got hit, I'd roll 4. And it says 0 to 3, I would apply an additional operational loss. Well, I rolled a 4, so I would just take the damage as normal. But your recruits, they don't absorb it as well. And that can represent also morale. They get shot at, they don't want to stick around to get shot at, kind of a thing. So as complicated as the book makes combat seem, it really isn't that difficult. And if you just follow the combat flow chart, it's super, super simple. Declare who's attacking, roll a die, a tie, nothing happens. Otherwise, the die result tells you where to go based on who rolled what die. Apply your modifiers, get your final modified firepower, apply the result, check for additional losses. It's simple. It goes fast. And once you start playing it, it is amazingly quick. So the last thing, though, this is what's so cool about the game and why I really like this. And I think I'll take an end there. This works really, really good with your infantry. The same thing would apply to tanks. We're going to talk about the weapon effect here for just a second. Mostly in terms of like your fire lane and your blast effects. Excuse me. So, what does that mean? Well, depending on the weapon type, you can either have like a 1 line and an arrow. That is essentially saying 1 perimeter of hexes. Here on the tank, there's 2 at the point of impact. So that would be 2 hexes out of effect. Basically, tanks have a big blast. Then we said this fire lane, which is another 5 hexes past the full length of the shooting here. So like for a tank, right, this first square is adjacent, then you go 5, out to 5, 10, 15, 20. So the gun can shoot at something up to 20 away accurately, but then you have 5 additional hexes for your fire lane. So when you're in urban combat, there's not too many places that have a full 20 hexes. So for example, here, I could probably count down this street, and eventually we might hit the 20 hexes, and then there's a building. Most of the time, you're maybe shooting 5 or 10 hexes. So why is that important to know? Well, I don't have a tank block out, but I do have my card with the RPG. Now, this is important because this affects things like friendly fire, is mostly what this is talking about. What the game wants you to think about in terms of urban combat is the fact that it's enclosed. You're fighting in city streets. You've got buildings on either side of you. It can be narrow at times. You might have civilians that are wandering around the battlefield, and you don't want to just shoot indiscriminately for, hurting the civilians. So with an RPG, it's a weapon I can't shoot adjacent because there's no value. I can't shoot up to 5 away because, again, there's no value. But I can shoot this up to 10 away. Now, if I have a target that's 10 spaces away, then it has one line. So that means one hex around that target can be affected by the blast of this RPG. Now, that's important because we saw that a triangle can shoot at any target. Well, I did have a case where I had somehow civilians had wandered into the area, and I had some Americans wander out. Now, my Somali player was actually further down. It was actually kind of in here. The crash site's like right in here for Super 6-1. So I had some Somalians that were here. They were going to round the corner, but this guy had rounded the corner, so this Somalian unit with the RPG wanted to take opportunity fire. Great. RPG is pretty devastating. However, because the RPG has that weapon effect of 1 hex radius, it would affect the population center negatively, so he couldn't shoot it. He could not shoot the RPG. The other thing, too, is you have the fire lane symbol. So fire lane, it's kind of an interesting concept too. Basically, it says when you're shooting, you take your maximum range, add 5 hexes, and then that entire line is filled with gunfire. So even though you have people that are shooting accurately, the fact that there's shrapnel and they're taking a lot of shots, a fire lane is established. So if I've got my American player here and he wants to shoot his machine guns, and he's got a range of 10, and then the extra box is 5 additional hexes of fire lane. So he'd have to count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ooh, let's count 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So even though my target might be back here, a lot closer than 15, bullets, stray bullets and shrapnel and ricochet and chaos and carnage and blood and snot continues along that path. So anything along this path could be affected by weapon effect. Now, they got a handy dandy chart. There's a lot of charts, but there's only a few that you really use. I'm going to show you this one here. It's the weapon effect chart in the book. I think I passed it. This is where I should have paused the video and found it, which I think we'll do. Hopefully through the magic of editing, this flows pretty well. So in the book, page 24, the weapons effect chart, essentially right here, it tells you then who's affected by the weapon effect. So if you've got light weapons, so most of the time that's what you're doing when it's infantry combat, light weapons. So it says right here, if it's around the shooter, there's no weapon effect. But if it's a heavy weapon like a tank cannon, then yes, there can be weapon effect. So if you have infantry standing next to a tank that fires, they could drop 1 operational strength point, 1's operational strength level. If you're in the fire lane, now you also know it's color-coded. Red is for enemy, blue is for friendly. So again, we'll talk about light weapons, since that's mostly what you're going to do. That's your machine guns and things. So in the fire lane, friendly troops are going to take damage. This is something that I thought was weird, and I think that's what confused me the most. So let's say I've got a fire lane established along here, and I've got a green unit, a red unit, and let me just grab one more friendly unit. What it's saying is, if this guy shoots, his fire lane goes all the way down this road plus some. This unit will take a step loss according to the chart because it's in the fire lane, but not the enemy. Okay, but the enemy will take damage at the target location. So if I had another enemy unit, he's not going to get hit by the fire lane, that extra shrapnel and stuff. And that's the part I think that's kind of really weird and people to grasp is, shouldn't everything in that fire lane be attacked? This is probably the simulationist part of the game, or the educational part. In fact, when you read in the back of the book, that was a design decision. That's on purpose. The idea is to get you thinking about those enclosed spaces and the chance of friendly fire. So the weapons effect is more punishing for friendly forces than for the enemy, because you wouldn't want to shoot down towards your buddy, right? So when you get setting up your game, this is where it gets you thinking about excuse me, strategy, such as, well, you know, I might want to put a person here, and I'm going to stay out of this guy's fire lane, because that's part of the communication with troops. You know, they stay in communication with each other because they don't want friendly fire. So I'm going to move up here and maybe shoot across. I'm not going to come down here, and we're not going to do a crossfire because they're just going to shoot each other because of the fire lane. So that's the power and importance of weapon effect. Now, how did that play out with an RPG? Well, the rules say that if you destroy a population center, you're going to lose victory points. And I think, if I remember right, this scenario says that the Somalian player won't shoot into population centers. So that's why that actually helped me out in a game I was playing earlier, because like I said, I had a ranger unit that rounded a corner. There was a population center nearby. The Somali unit could have shot that RPG, but because the population center was here and the way weapon effect works, it would have destroyed the population center. So he couldn't shoot that weapon. That's what the game gets you thinking about, is how to employ your surroundings and what effect do these modern day weapons have on the surroundings. And it does that in a very simple way. Again, your card will show you if there's any weapon effect. So rifles, no weapon effect, but they create a fire lane. So you want to stay out of fire lanes. RPGs have weapon effect. So at the point of impact, there's a possibility that it will affect things around it. So you want to make sure that you are aware of your troop movements, because you can't shoot at your own people essentially. And then also it has a fire lane. So that's what I think is really good about the game. It maybe is a little confusing at first, is understanding weapon effect, the effect points, how that compares to like movement points. Basically, the effect points are like movement points for actions. That's really what drives this game, is understanding those weapon effects so you can maneuver your troops. Otherwise, this game just plays like any other game. You move your people, you shoot at target hexes, you're good to go. But this really, excuse me, this really gets you kind of stepped up a notch and thinking about the bigger overall effect of combat. What does shrapnel do? What does it mean to have a fire lane? I think the only other game that kind of has the concept of like a fire lane is like Advanced Squad Leader. You can create a fire lane and you'll have a marker with residual firepower. This doesn't have residual firepower, but the fire lane is much longer. So you have to be much more aware of your troop movements. You don't want to set up a situation where you're shooting each other. So I think that's just pretty amazing. And the tanks follow the same rules essentially. It's really not different. The only thing with tanks is that you have to be aware of your symbols, what your weapons can affect. So if you've got M16s, they can affect circle targets. Well, a tank is like a triangle target, so they're immune to most everything that's done by weapons. They have to be hit by heavy weapons. So everything on the game is real simple. The mechanics are actually pretty simple once you play it. Everything has a symbol to let you know if it's a eligible target or not. And then the combat, again, is basically just a one die roll combat system. Follow the flow on your chart. Higher firepower wins. You apply losses. Roll a die to see if your recruit status or elite status saves you or hinders you. watch out for weapon effects so you're not creating situations where you're shooting your own people, and use population to your advantage. I use that a lot as I can when I play like Mogadishu. I try to move near population centers so that the Somali player won't shoot at me, and vice versa, the American player won't shoot at population centers either. So it seems like there's a lot in the game, but once you play it, it actually turns out to be fairly simple and it rolls pretty smooth. So hopefully that clarifies some things for you. I was trying not to confuse people, but if you have questions or want to see more examples, I'm going to try and set this up at some point to maybe play through a couple turns of a game so you can kind of see the bits and pieces in motion. But if there's anything else you want to see more of, just let me know. It takes it's a pretty big rule book, like I said, but the basic concepts, and once you play it, it plays out pretty good. So anyway, I hope that was informational for you, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.